So I'm a Christian, and I assume you're a skeptic. My goal is to explain why I think Christians are justified in thinking that the Gospel of John relates true events in a truthful way. John's prologue begins with the following statement: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through Him." If you're even remotely familiar with the book of Genesis, you'll recognize immediately that John's prologue derives its main ideas about Jesus from the Genesis creation story. This may be a non-starter for skeptics who think that the Genesis creation story is nothing but silly myth, but a skeptic can't reasonably deny that Christians have held traditionally that the worldview Genesis 1 asserts is the most important truth it conveys, and that ancient readers didn't understand the story as a scientific account. So leaving aside modern debates about literalism versus symbolism, let's focus instead on how the Genesis creation story helps to explain the unique worldview that differentiated ancient Israel from the surrounding Gentile nations. The central idea was that the world is a created thing with a definite beginning, and that the beginning was caused by Yahweh, the name ascribed to God. The fact that the universe is a created thing with a beginning in time is important because it sets up a stark contrast with Israel's unique conception of God as Yahweh. The meaning of the name Yahweh is derived in the book of Exodus from the Hebrew verb I am, and means something like He is, or more precisely, He is being. So whereas the world is a collection of created things changing through time, God is the one uncreated being whom time doesn't affect. By analogy, the created universe is something like an artificially constructed boat, and God is the long-standing water that floats it. Just as there'd be no floating boat if there were no water, so there'd be no created universe without the uncreated God to float it. By contrast, the Gentile nations surrounding Israel told creation stories in which even the gods themselves had emerged from an eternal, uncreated, universal chaos. Within the Hebrew Scriptures, the distinction between God and the created world is so crucial that it explains the most striking commands about early Israelite worship: that there should be only one temple, and that the one temple not have any crafted image of Yahweh. Meanwhile, Gentile cities would have hundreds of temples dedicated to hundreds of gods, and these gods were always depicted with some type of material object or image. The Jewish conception of Yahweh couldn't be depicted because it derogated the eternal Creator to represent Him with an image manufactured out of the created world. God in His essence, therefore, was hidden or veiled from the created world and could be directly observed only in the occasional appearing of God in a cloud of glory located in the inner room of the temple. But even through the long stretches of Israelite history where God didn't directly appear, Israelites didn't speak of God as any more hidden to human understanding than pylons are hidden from a person walking upon a bridge. God was present in the world and good, whether seen or not. John highlights this idea by adding, "In Him was life, and the life was the light of men." His point isn't merely that Jesus is alive, that there's life in Him just as there's life in us. Rather, he means that Jesus is the ultimate source of all life. Life in this sense is like light. Just as light can't exist apart from a light source, in a similar way, living things don't exist apart from a living source. That is, a living thing exists because it comes from another living thing, and that living thing exists because it comes from yet another living thing, and so on, all the way back to the initial source of life. All living things, then, are like a giant light beam, attesting to the reality and nature of their ultimate source. You can see already, therefore, why the climax of John's book is going to be the Anointed One's resurrection. For that will be the most powerful witness to this claim that Jesus is the initial and ultimate source of life. As a quick reminder, I'm not trying to convince you of this worldview, but only to explain how it helps us understand the big claims of John's prologue, namely, that Jesus of Nazareth is the uncreated God Yahweh, who made the world of created time-bound things, and that therefore he is the ultimate source of life. Notice how John makes this point by playing off the verb from which the name Yahweh is derived. He says that at the time of the beginning, Jesus, the Word, already was, or more literally, was being. To make the point clearer, John adds bluntly, the Word was being God. The second thing he asserts is that the world was made through the Word. And John's Greek verb more literally means became or came into being, and is in contrast with the expression the Word was being. In short, Jesus has the same essence as the eternal Creator Yahweh, who always is being, and who is the source of the world that came into being. The third big claim John makes comes a few verses later when he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Again, John's verb does some heavy lifting. The word became flesh, or came into the being of flesh. So when Jesus became a human, he became a part of the existence of the created world. This implies that the world couldn't directly recognize God in Jesus. For in the flesh, God would appear to be nothing more than human, unless he did something to show his fuller identity. And John calls the works of Jesus that reveal this fuller identity signs. And we'll talk more about them in future videos. This brings us to the final claim that John emphasizes. Quote, "We have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace." According to John, Jesus is the fullest expression of who God is and what God is like. John clearly believes that the Hebrew Scriptures are faithful records of how God revealed many important things about himself through history. But the sum of all these revelations amounts only to a partial understanding of God. By contrast, John claims that God's revelation of himself in Jesus was full, and the world has received God's grace from this fullness. Now, words, or lights, after all, are metaphors for disclosure. They reveal thoughts and truths which otherwise would be hidden in darkness. So if a person wants to know the fullness of God's mind and heart, John insists that they have to look to the words and light of Jesus. Now, one can hardly blame Jews or Muslims who take their religion seriously from feeling some offense at John's bold claims because they step on some of the beliefs of Jews and Muslims. But John himself was a Jew and clearly believed these truths about Jesus just as sincerely as others hold their views. But can a modern thinker take John's basic worldview seriously? Well, with respect to an absolute beginning to the universe, or multiverse, there's no consensus view in physics. Some physicists think that the universe had to have had an absolute beginning, and others don't. One can only say that the Big Bang certainly leaves the impression of a universe that had a beginning of some kind. That's why it has the age of 13.8 billion years and not infinity. This impression may one day be universally rejected, but for now, the idea of an absolute beginning is perfectly credible. What about the idea that something like eternal word is the fundamental principle of the universe? Well, John's word for word is logos and means speech or expression. It carries the idea of rational order because speech, in most people anyway, conveys ordered thoughts and meaning. There are many reasons to think that the universe at bottom is eternal word or logos. First, science seems to proceed quite successfully on the assumption that the universe is rationally ordered by something like logos. Only among scientists, they don't speak of logos, but of the laws of nature. Second, there are many things like mathematics, logic, and even morality that seem obviously to most people to exist within and yet somehow beyond the material world. Third, life itself at its cellular level also seems to be characterized by something close to the idea of logos, DNA, after all, seems remarkably analogous to language. Now, one can reject or be agnostic about whether the fundamental principle of the universe is something like eternal logos. But to the Christian, the very scientific enterprise itself, not to mention some of its most important findings, seems perfectly consistent with the idea. Now, all of this leaves open the question whether John's big claims about the historical person Jesus of Nazareth are true. But I would point out simply that a person who summarily rejects key aspects of this larger underlying worldview will be much less likely to think John's claims about Jesus are worth serious consideration. Not so much because the claims are intrinsically too incredible to seriously weigh, but because the skeptic has rejected previously the worldview that frames them. Now, one is free to do so, of course, but be prepared for Christians to expect that an alternative, coherent worldview be offered in its place. Otherwise, they may be inclined to take the skeptic even less seriously than the skeptic is inclined to take them. And this isn't intended as a jab. It's just a realistic assessment of any attempt by the two parties to discuss John's gospel. I hope this is helpful to you in some way, and I'll try to respond to thoughtful questions and criticisms in the comments section.